Hello, everyone. So this is about planetary dignity. And I'm going to use an example chart here, Sean Combs, or P Diddy, as he's known. And it's a very interesting chart. It is a very afflicted chart, a lot of undignified planets. So before I get into his chart, though, I want to just talk about what is planetary dignity, first of all, without getting into the nuance of it and all of the calculations. There are many. And for those who joined the course, the module one of the timing techniques course, we went through all of these strengths and states and all of those. And you would notice in Indian astrology, there are a lot more calculations for planetary strengths. It's not just about in its own sign or exalted, debilitated. There are a lot of different states apart from strengths. Planets can be combust in an angry state. They can be unhappy, content, all these different states, right? It's not just about strengths. It's strengths, states, and placements by house position as well. So many things to work out. But the point to be made here is apart from that, when you've worked out the strength and state of a planet and how that functions, this notion that I've seen this as a trend in recent years in astrology, more especially in Western astrology circles. There was a whole group that came together in 2020, I think it was, and they called themselves the Dignity Babes. And they used the hashtag Dignity Babes. You might be able to look it up. And so it's a group of Western astrologers essentially who came together and they were kind of pushing back against this whole notion that, planetary dignity shows that, if you see a planet in an undignified place, in a weak place, that it can't express itself, in a strong way or something. I'm not sure exactly the actual language they were using, the exact language. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But what the whole and I get their approach. I got what they were talking about. I got the sense of if you just kind of black and white statements say that that's good and that's bad, that's not necessarily the way to approach it because it's not whether a planet is exalted or debilitated or in its own sign or not. There's so much more. And actually, there's so much more in Indian astrology than they use in Western astrology to see if a planet is dignified. But the arguments they were coming up with were a bit sort of, for me, yes, I understand we shouldn't approach astrology in a black and white way, good or bad. However, if you skirt around that good or bad in fear of like being labeled judgmental or something, you actually are not calling it for what it is. I mean, again, why have all of these kinds of calculations, whether it's strength or states or whatever it is, if you're not going to come to a judgment in the end? Because at the end of the day, you're not judging the person, you're judging the chart. So that's a really important point to make here. A lot of even Vedic astrology, I've noticed in the last few years, they've started to say things like, we're trying to stay away from this good and bad language. Again, I kind of get it because you don't want to be too black and white. But again, if you never say good or bad, then you're never calling it. You're never actually saying, what is that thing? And this is a perfect example with Sean Combs. And I'm just going to show you how this can be bad when you have planets that are very weak as they are in his chart. It doesn't mean that everybody with these placements are going to experience this the same way or express this in the same way. But when you see a confluence here in his chart, as we'll see, it just comes out in the worst way. And we can't say this is good. Like, who is this good for? Is it good for the 100 people now that are coming forward and suing Sean Combs for sexual exploitation? Obviously not. It's not good for them. Is it good for P. Diddy himself, Sean Combs? Is it good for him? I would say not either, even if he had his fun and and sex games and all of that with all of these people. Um, is it good for him? No, even if he enjoyed it initially, like it's not good for his soul. This is the thing. This is the thing about dignity. If you're feeling dignified, you're feeling good about yourself, you love and respect yourself, you are going to easily love and respect everyone else. If you don't love and respect yourself, you're not going to respect and love other people. And this is quite clearly borne out in this case. So I'll give you his chart details, but I'll just say that, and actually, I'm going to show you this simpler chart because we don't know his time. We don't know his time at all. So I'm just going to give you his birth date. He was born on the 4th of November, 1969, and I'll put in like 12 noon. I was initially playing with Leo, but I'm going to use Leo anyway because you'll see that's his moon sign. He was born in Harlem, New York. So ignore the ascendant, the AS. We don't know his ascendant. And Actually, without knowing his ascendant, we can't really figure out all the strengths and states because you need to know the house positions. But anyway, we do know his moon sign because the moon was absolutely in Leo, and we're going to use Leo moon sign as the rising sign. So, and we'll just forget about the ascendant here, just look at the moon, and that itself will tell the story, as we'll see. It doesn't tell the whole story, but you'll see. So, the moon in Leo, first of all, is that dignified? Moon in Leo generally is dignified because it's in the sun sign and they're friends to each other, and it's like lighting up the moon. And so that is seen as a good thing, except for the fact that the sun is debilitated in Libra. So that's not necessarily a good thing, but we can't stop there either. We can't just say sun in Libra is bad, simple as. It's not always the case. In this case, it is, and I'll show you that that sun is not supported. There's no Banga yoga, as they're called, this mitigating factor. There are no other planets helping out the sun really, apart from Mars somewhat, but even then, that's a bit nuanced. But in essence, the sun here is weak. Essentially, it is weak. And it's not supporting the moon, therefore, in Leo. And we also see here Ketu, the south node of the moon, in Leo. And what we're having right now actually is the eclipse of the sun in Virgo. And so this is why this has come out now, by the way, that it's been leading to this, that the sun, in this case, the Leo 9 figure, the sort of entertainer, the leader in his field, the leader in these parties, you might say as well. The darker side, the Ketu shadow side of Leo is coming out right now because Ketu is eclipsing the sun in Virgo. So he's being held accountable, that's Virgo, for his past actions. That's Ketu, the past. And subsequently, of course, Ketu will move into Leo from next year. And I think it won't be just him, it'll be a lot of people in the entertainment industry that are going to be questioned around their dealings with him. So we're going to see a lot of that come out. At any rate, it's tainted here. The sun, the Leo, the moon in Leo is not clear, crystalline. It is tainted by the shadow and then weakened by the sun's debilitation. And by the way, according to many astrologers, the sun here is exactly debilitated, almost exactly by 19 degrees. 19 degrees is, by most Western astrology calculations, the debilitation degree, whereas in Vedic astrology is 10 degrees. And I'm not going to get into that here, that whole argument. It's 10 or 19. Either way, the sun is weak. So then what are the planets that would have taken the sun out of debilitation, or as it were, or mitigated the sun's debilitation, even though the sun itself is so important to keep strong in any which way you can, because the sun is the center. And if you have a strong sun, you feel a strong sense of self and self-esteem and self-respect. If you don't, then if you lack that, everything can crumble because literally the sun is holding everything in place. Everything is spinning around the sun. And it doesn't matter how strong other things are in a way if the sun is weak, because if you don't have a sense of confidence, everything else can fall apart. You could have so many strong planets and then a weak sun, but at the same time, the only thing about that is usually what happens then is that other strong planets in a way mitigate the weak sun and prop up the sun and prop up one's self-confidence. So that in a way kind of works better. But in this case, there's a weak sun and the weak planets that are not supporting. So nothing is supporting this sun in a way. Again, apart from Mars, but we'll get to that. That's in a way an affliction in another way. Maybe not for him initially, but for other people around him, quite obviously, and the kind of violence that he's visited allegedly on other people. So there are three planets that can take the sun out of debilitation or mitigate the sun's weakness. They are Venus, Saturn, and Mars. Venus because it rules Libra, where the sun is in its weakest. Saturn because Saturn is exalted in Libra, and Mars because Mars rules the opposite Aries where the sun exalts. So those three, Venus, Saturn, and Mars, are the three planets that can help the sun out. And as you can see already, if you're looking ahead, Venus and Saturn are both debilitated. There's a lot of debilitated planets in this chart. Sun is debilitated. Venus, the ruler of the sun, is also debilitated in Virgo, in the last degree of Virgo, and in a planetary war within a degree of Jupiter. So this Venus is afflicted, absolutely, in a planetary war, debilitated at the last degree of Virgo. So it's not helping the sun at all. And now what we're talking about is actually an affliction to Venus more than anything in terms of Venus-related matters, in terms of sex and money. And as you'll see here as well, from the moon's perspective, Venus is in the second sign of money and is exchanging with Mercury in the third sign of sex. So it's all about money and sex, essentially, from the moon's perspective. And the moon, by the way, itself is more likely in Purva Falguni, unless he was born earlier in the morning, like say before 9 a.m. If he was born after 9 or during the day, it was Purva Falguni, which is associated with Venus in the middle of Leo. It's all about pleasure seeking. It's all about sex and lust and enjoyment and creativity and higher aspirations as well of the sign. But in this case, obviously, it's bringing in the darker themes because Venus, again, is debilitated and that eclipse is there. So, or the southern eclipse point, Ketu. So this is affliction upon affliction upon affliction in this chart. And is this good? No. I would say it's not good for the people he's come in contact with for sure. Might have been good for him temporarily. In the long run, in the grand scheme of things, absolutely not. There's another thing about this here, Venus and Jupiter, and another really important point to be made here as well, because when you have a planet in a war with another planet, one of them is going to win out, right? But no one wins in a war. And of course, as we're seeing wars now, you can see that it doesn't matter who actually wins. Nobody wins. Both sides lose. But in essence, in for many calculations here that are placed on Venus, depending again on what the ascendant is, we don't know the ascendant, but I've looked at it and looked around the chart and what it might have been. More signs than not, Venus actually wins the war, interestingly enough. And it's essentially because of this calculation called Shadbal, this six strengths, and it calculates a lot of different things based on the planet other than just debilitation. So actually, Venus is most likely winning this war. And anyway, it's considered that when the planet is in a higher degree than the other planet it's in a war with, it will win. It's on top. So this is seen. And by the way, we don't even have to wonder which is winning. We can see which is winning. In other words, Venus and Jupiter are at war in this person, as in these two parts of his being are in conflict within him. And Venus is winning out over Jupiter quite obviously because Venus, sex is more important to him than doing the right thing, than doing the Jupiter thing, than respecting others, Jupiter, doing the ethical thing. Venus is winning the war. And what is Venus again? Just because it's winning the war, it's still a debilitated Venus winning a war. So it's still a afflicted Jupiter, Venus. So in other words, an afflicted Venus is winning out over the right thing, i.e., an abusive Venus, an exploitative Venus, somebody who can exploit and even sex traffic allegedly, right? So you can see how nuanced it is. You can't just say debilitated, exalted, in a war, that planet wins the war, therefore, Venus wins out, and that's good for Venus. No, it's a debilitated Venus all the same. So that's Venus. And even though Venus and Mercury are exchanging in the second and third house from the moon's perspective, anyway, we don't know from the ascendant, but from the moon, it's second and third house. This is when we can bring in good and bad language because there are certain houses in Vedic astrology that are seen as good and certain houses that are seen as bad, literally bad places, Dushthana. And the sixth, eighth, and 12th house are seen as the Dushtanas, but the third house is seen as a minor Dushthana. So in this case, when you have any of the third, sixth, eighth, and 12th houses exchanging with any of the other houses, it's not seen as a good thing because it creates challenges. Why would anyone want challenges, in that sense? And you might say, well, okay, you rise to the challenge, you might say. But when you see a chart like this with so many afflictions already, and then you're placing another affliction upon it, it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. It's just not, he's not going to be able to help himself. He's not going to be able to lift himself up out of this. And again, this is not judging him. This is judging his afflictions in his chart. And I would actually argue, by the way, that instead of saying that we're judging a person, that actually by using astrology and judging the chart, the afflictions in the chart as bad, that we're more likely to be in a position to not judge the person. So let me say that again because it's so important. I feel like since I've studied astrology, that I'm a less judgmental person simply because when I see things in people's charts, I understand why they do what they do. I understand who they are. Even if they're like a rapist, even if they're a killer, I don't judge them, I judge the chart. So that's an argument for actually making judgments like good and bad, I would say. But anyway, good and bad houses, again, bad houses, third, sixth, eighth and 12th, when they mix with the others, and in this case, it's mixing with the third house and the second house, that's not seen as a good thing. So it's adding further affliction, even if there's a strength that comes out of that. And of course, he has strengths in many other ways because he's been a very professional, or sorry, successful. That was a Freudian slip, I think. Not professional, very successful businessman, very wealthy. All of this second house matter obviously has been really there. And the third house matter is all there. He's an entertainer, all of that, etc., etc., right? But anyway, that's Venus and the sun. What about Saturn? Saturn is quite obviously not helping the sun out, even though it's opposite, and it would be the one planet I would say that could, because it's aspecting the sun. It's debilitated. So the sun is debilitated and now Saturn's debilitated opposite. And even though Saturn is retrograde, and that you could argue is kind of like a mixed bag itself, and it might behave as if it's also exalted. Indeed, it does. You could imagine even that Saturn is in Libra, exalted. However, if that were the case, Saturn in Libra is with a debilitated sun, and that would not be a good case at all. If you literally place Saturn here with the sun actually drags Saturn down, drags that exalted Saturn down. When an exalted planet is with a debilitated planet, the exalted planet is dragged down by the debilitated planet, and the debilitated planet is actually propped up. So the sun in this case, if just imagine the Saturn was in Libra here with the sun would be propped up by that. The sun would be helped out. And I do think the sun is being helped out by this Saturn. It is one mitigating factor here. But Saturn itself would be dragged down from its exaltation. So at any rate, it's debilitated at the end of the day, and it's not really helping out too much. Even though, again, you might say that he has the tenacity, the forbearance to stick with it. I mean, you almost have to admire the guy for like sticking with what he did for so long. I just can't believe that he got away with it for so long, to be honest with you, that he was able to abuse so many people for so many years. I mean, this is the kind of a Saturn type of thing, isn't it? So the other planet, the third planet that could help out, but it's not really. In a way it is, but it's not really. But who's it helping, you might ask, is Mars. Because Mars rules Aries, where the sun is exalted, and Mars is exalted itself. So Mars is exalted, it's very powerful, right? That's good, is it? Is it good? For who? For people he abused? Mars, when exalted, can be abusive. Mars is exchanging with Saturn, a debilitated Saturn. Now it's behaving stronger. It's behaving as if it's in Aries, opposite the sun. So that's good, maybe. Then Saturn is in Capricorn, also good. But again, good for who is the question. And, again, not for his victims, I would say. But for him personally, it might have given him the strength and the forbearance to keep going, even though he didn't feel it. So he's obviously overcompensating for a lot of lack of self-esteem, essentially, and a lack of self-love and self-respect, I would say. And that has borne out, um, allegedly. So the other planet or shadow planet that is actually quite dignified, and in a way, the most dignified, because Mars is getting mixed up here with Saturn. So there's a mixed bag here with Mars itself. But that is Rahu. Rahu is actually in its own sign, Aquarius. So it's actually dignified. But what does that mean? Is that good? Rahu is a rogue, is a shadow planet, is going to behave like a rogue, no matter how exalted or dignified it is. A dignified rogue is a rogue. And so this is a person who doesn't have very healthy boundaries. It's in the seventh from the moon, and it's ruled by also Saturn, remember, Aquarius, which is debilitated. So he hasn't got clear boundaries, this person, obviously. I mean, he's abused, allegedly, all of these people. So no three guesses. I'll give you three guesses. You don't need three guesses as to what dasha he's in. I'm just giving you a hint there. He's most likely in a Rahu dasha right now. And even though we don't know his time, it's most likely Rahu dasha. We don't know the Bhukti for sure, but wherever I move this moon, beginning or end of Leo, it's most likely Rahu dasha. And Rahu can make somebody infamous. It's like, you know, coming into prominence in some way, but for all the wrong reasons. Which is quite obviously the case now. And for what reasons? For his relationships. Rahu in the seventh. And not only that, but again, Saturn in Aries, and Aries again ruled by Mars exalted, and in the sixth from the moon, and all of that. I mean, it's the violence, really. It's so exploitative, apparently, allegedly. It was sex trafficking. It was like a sexual abuse, and And maybe more. I mean, again, allegedly, we might find out a bit about this in the coming years, but there's a lot of things that have been a lot of mud that's been slung at him now. We'll see what sticks and all of that. But they're even implicating him in certain deaths, allegedly. So we shall see. It's all going to come out, I think. And again, especially as Ketu moves into Leo from next year, next May, for the year and a half to follow, I think we're going to see a lot of things dragged out, a lot of things, and a lot of people in the entertainment industry dragged into this as well. So that's just one example and chart that I've seen that a chart that I think that is very afflicted. I haven't seen as afflicted chart like this in a long time. And in this case, there was just one thing after another, kind of just not supporting him. And whatever about his background, I don't know about his background, his childhood experiences. Obviously, there was a lot of afflictions there. He pulled himself up out of it, and that is maybe testament to the tenacity of, the Saturn maybe and the Mars and all of that. But these quote unquote malefic planets, and again, we're using language like malefic, or cruel, as they're called in Indian astrology. They're cruel. That doesn't mean it's bad. It makes somebody act cruel though. And maybe it's kind of like a case of cruel to be kind in some instances where people do good by others and they're cruel to be kind. But sometimes it's just cruel to be cruel when it's afflictions, so there's a lot of afflictions in this chart. Um, yeah, so I'm going to leave it there for now, because again, this is a topic we could probably talk about in a whole group setting in an astrophilosophy group, because of this whole thing about dignities and planets and the language we use around this. And I just wanted to make the point about, not being too sort of scared to use language like good and bad, but not overusing it, of course. But when we try and, steer clear from it completely, we're just not delineating anything necessarily. We're constantly labeling in astrology. We're looking at planets and signs and houses and planets in signs and houses as certain indications. And so that was my only point. I hope you got something out of that. It is an afflicted chart, absolutely. And I think at this time with the eclipse and all the afflictions of this eclipse and how it's all being dredged up now, and even in the wars in the world, we have to be mindful of how we judge the chart and not the person or the situation. Even a war, like we should look at this war as astrologers and say, you know, this is happening exactly when it should be happening. There's nothing wrong here in another way. And that might sound like ridiculous to say, but when you think about that, that is what astrology does for us. It makes us realize that everything happens as it should. Even a war, we don't then make a judgment that this should not be happening now or whatever, or this person should not be the way he is. He is the way he is because this is what is. A war is happening now because a war is happening now. It's in the lineup of the heavens. Everything is happening as it should be. I use that phrase all the time. Everything is happening perfectly. I don't say it to mean to sugarcoat everything and say everything is perfect. No, I say everything is happening perfectly, which means everything is happening perfectly. It doesn't mean that it's good. It doesn't mean that it's what you would want, but it's all happening perfectly. So anyway, I hope you got something from that. If you have any questions about any of that, any comments about this chart, I would love to hear your comments. Any thoughts at all? Post below. Okay, until next time.